Hey everybody, it's Steve Van Tassel here coming at you for Dynasty Owner. And we are going to be talking today, continuing our series about tiers, and we're going to talk about starting wide receiver tiers. Now, what you might be asking yourself, why are we discussing starting wide receiver tiers? Well, as I started to work on this article, it just got very long. There's just so many wide receivers out there. So many teams use 3 wide receiver sets. There's just tons of wide receivers, more so than even running backs, even though you start the same number of running backs as wide receivers in Dynasty Owner. There's just more wide receivers that play on NFL teams, and therefore more wide receivers who are fantasy relevant. So I ended up deciding that in order to not have one gigantic article and video, that we would break it up into 2. So the first one's going to be what we're going to call the starting wide receivers. And they're the top 53 wide receivers. They're anybody who's projected to get 200 or more Dynasty Owner fantasy points in the 2021 season, projections based on what RotoWire has for Dynasty Owner. We're using our scoring system. So it'll be interesting. The other thing about these tiers is that I think they're very debatable because it was very difficult to put players in certain tiers and structure the tiers and also to rank the tiers. It felt like it was easier with the running backs, tight ends, and quarterbacks to do so. Here with the wide receivers, I think people might have a little more difference of opinion. So be interesting to hear what everybody has to say about that. So without further ado, we're going to talk about our starting wide receiver tiers. And this is, as I said, part 1, the starters. So the starting wide receiver tiers, we've got tier 1A, which are the elite cheap wide receivers. Cheap's kind of sometimes can be seen to be a bad word, but it's actually good here in Dynasty Owner because it means you don't have to spend a lot of salary on these guys. And there's 3 of them. You got Terry McLaurin at the top there, making just under $1 million, down to A.J. Brown making $1.4 million a year. And the important thing is that their projections are that they're all going to score over 300 Dynasty Owner fantasy points projected in 2021. And that's what makes them elite. There's 9 guys who have that projection, and these are 3 of them. And all of them are extremely affordable. I would say that these should be the first 3 wide receivers off the board in Dynasty Owner drafts. You might differ on that. You might like somebody else better, but for the combination of salary and points, you can't do better. The next we have tier 1B, which is sort of what we're calling the almost elite cheap wide receivers. And why are they almost elite? Because they've got slightly lower projected points. You got Deontay Johnson, who's projected to get 262.3 points, and Deebo Samuel, who's projected to get 252.6 points. Deontay Johnson's a little over $1 million, whereas Deebo's $1.8 million. He's kind of on the high end. But these guys they're just a step below the elite ones. That's why they're almost elite. So then we go to tier 2A, which is also elite wide receivers, but they're just slightly more expensive. And there's 2 guys listed here. You may think that these guys are the best 2 wide receivers out there. And I think right now in Dynasty Owner drafts, they're being drafted as two of the top wide receivers going early, along with DK Metcalf. But this is Calvin Ridley and Justin Jefferson. Ridley's $2.7 million and Justin Jefferson's $3.28 million. They're both going to get about 305 projected Dynasty Owner fantasy points. And the good news is that you got Ridley for 2 years and you got Jefferson for 3 more years at that salary. So hopefully they are scoring you a lot of points on your Dynasty Owner team for a long time. Next, we've got the almost elite, but slightly more expensive wide receivers. You can see what we've been doing here in tier 1 and tier 2. So the almost elite, there's 4 of them. The last one's a little debatable. We'll get into that in a minute. But the top 3 are DJ Moore, Brandon Ayuk, and CeeDee Lamb. And DJ Moore makes about $2.8 million. Ayuk makes about 3.1, and CeeDee Lamb makes 3.5. They're all getting in the 260, 250 range. So they're going to provide almost elite level points for just a little bit over what those the tier 1 guys are. You're paying the tier 1 guys. Now, Judy's the interesting case on this list, and I struggled with where to put him. He ended up falling here because of his salary's in the right range, the year's in the right range. He's a little lower on projected points, but I just didn't feel like he belonged anywhere else, so I kind of put him here. If you disagree, still like the video, please like the video, but throw something in the comments explaining why you disagree with me. Maybe watch the rest of the video first to see where you would put him, but get some discussion, see what everybody thinks. Next, we go to Tier 3A, which is elite and expensive wide receivers. And the important part on these guys is they all have long-term contracts. Long-term meaning 2 to 3 years. It's kind of a misnomer, but, you've got Stephon Diggs and Tyreek Hill. The difference between the elite wide receiver with the fifth most expensive salary is Justin Jefferson. He's $3.28 million. The one with the sixth highest salary is Stephon Diggs. He's $14.4 million. So you can see why in regular fantasy leagues and dynasty leagues, you'd have them in the same tier. It wouldn't be a problem. Salary wouldn't matter. But this is dynasty owner. Salary matters. And Stephon Diggs is $11 million more. So he goes in a slightly lower tier. And there's only 2 guys who are in this tier because not a lot. There's only 9 elite receivers. Only 2 of them make this much money and have multiple years on their contract. The next one, we have the elite / high end and expensive wide receivers on 1-year contracts. And the reason why we combined elite and high end is because I didn't want some tiers of 1. That's where Devontae Adams would have fit in. Guess he could have gone to Tier 3A, but he only has 1 year left on his contract, and who knows what's going to happen. He is projected to have the most dynasty owner fantasy points this year at 330.2, but the 1-year contract means he could get paid next year. Just as well as Chris Godwin and Allen Robinson. Both of them are just outside the elite range. They're more high-end, we'll call them. But both of them, if they play well, they're going to get paid again. Both of them on Godwin and Robinson are on franchise tags, and they've only got 1 year left on that. So that's why I like the 3A tier guys better because I know their salary for 2 or 3 years, as opposed to these guys who they could get more next year. Tier 4, we go exactly the opposite way, and we've got some great value 2nd-year wide receivers. And this tier contains another guy who a lot of people might think is misplaced, and that's Chase Claypool. Some people might be screaming at their screen right now or on the podcast, listening to a podcast saying, how can you have Jerry Jeudy ranked again ahead of Chase Claypool? Well, it's just the way these fell in. All these guys have about the same salary. Why? Because they're all drafted in the 2nd round of last year's NFL draft. They're all projected to get around the same number of points. Claypool and Higgins are going to get you around 250 points projected, whereas Laviska Shenault, who I probably mispronounced, is going to get you 212, and Michael Pittman's going to get you 210, 211. But they're all roughly the same salary, 3 years left on their contract. It made a nice little tier of 4 guys, so that's why I put them there. So right now you're probably saying, well, where are the rookies? Well, here they are, the rookie early 1st-round draft pick wide receivers. And because it's dynasty owner, we had to separate those early. We had 5 wide receivers taken in the 1st round, but we had to separate the first 3, Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase, and Jalen Waddle, because they make so much more than the other guys. Those other guys, Kadarius Toney and Rashad Bateman, don't appear to this week because they're probably not going to be starters on your dynasty owner team this year. But these 3 guys should be. You're going to draft them high. You're going to draft them for the long haul, and hopefully they're going to improve. I mean, don't expect them to be balling out the 300 points this year, but they're all projected to get over 200, but not quite 250. So that's good. A lot of you're not going to mind. I mean, part of the problem with why they're a little bit lower is they make more. They make $5, $6, $7.5 million versus some of the other guys we've talked about earlier, those elite guys who are making like $1, $2, $3 million a year. And that's a big difference in dynasty owner. But I'm sure if you draft any of these guys and they produce this many points, and they might just get better and they might just move into that elite tier. So you're probably not going to mind if you draft these guys high and they play well. So next is an interesting tier. We've got some great value young wide receivers, but all of them just have 1 year left on their contract. And those guys are the following. They're all They're all right there. About $1 million. Cortland Sutton's a little high at $1.7 million. And Traquan Smith and Michael Gallup are low. They're under $1 million a year. They also are projected to score fewer points than Sutton and Shark. So what their values get tighter because of that. But Traquan Smith is interesting because he probably wasn't on this list until a couple of days ago. The Michael Thomas news has vaulted him into this, being a starter on your Dynasty on a fantasy team, probably. He may have been on this list, but he was definitely not as much of a value in the four. His Dynasty dollar per point value, the last column here, if you're watching the video, is about a little over $4,000. And he was more, his value is higher. So he was below DJ Chark before the Michael Thomas injury news. So next, we've got tier 7. We've got some high-end $16 million wide receivers with multi-year contracts. And these are familiar names. These guys have been around for a couple of years. They've produced for a couple of years. They're going to produce again, probably. It's just you're going to pay them about $16 million a year. Mike Evans is 16.5. Cooper Jarvis Landry is at 15.1. We still put him in there. It's a little off. It's not like the tight end tier that we had when 3 guys made $6.013 million last week. But, they make about $16 million. None of you are going to be upset if you have these guys and they produce these points. They're going to be very helpful. Nice to have in your starting lineup. Next, we've got some guys who are high end and just very expensive. They're even more expensive, and they got those long-term contracts. Actually, these contracts, all of the guys on this tier, we've got 7 guys on this tier, and they all got at least 3 or 4 year contracts, and they're more than the $16 million. They're making at least $18 million, all the way up to DeAndre Hopkins, who makes $27.25 million this year for 4 years. He's going to get you elite level production, projected at over 300 Dynasty on fantasy points, but that's not enough to offset that extra salary. So these are all familiar names: Kenny Golladay, Keenan Allen, OBJ, Amari Cooper, Julio Jones, DeAndre Hopkins, and Michael Thomas. And Thomas, he's gone down. The news that he might not be playing for a couple of weeks has depressed his value. It'll probably raise his ADP. You probably be able to find him a lot later in drafts if you're drafting than you have been. And if you drafted him last year, you might be considering whether to amnesty him or not. I know I did amnesty him when we had the chance at the end of last year, and I'm happy I did it. That's a lot of money. I couldn't afford it on the team I had him on, and I'm glad that I'm not worrying about what to do now and have $19.25 million being occupied by Thomas. We're getting near the end. We've got tier 9. This is a couple of guys. I probably should have called this the Brown tier. Why? Because it's Antonio Brown and Marquise Brown, not Cleveland Browns. But they're low end. They're falling at the bottom of they're near the bottom, just over 200 points projected. They make about $3 million each. And they both have the name Brown. So that's why they're a tier. Tier 10 is very good production, mid-range salary, 1-year contract guys. And you probably can think of these guys. It's Juju, Tyler Lockett, Robbie Anderson, Will Fuller, and Mike Williams. Williams is a little outside the salary range, but we put him in here anyways, even though he makes $15 million, which is a little higher than the $10 million that most of the rest of the guys make on here. They're all going to get 200 to 250 Dynasty on fantasy points. Fuller's a little lower because remember, he's got the 1-game suspension, so he's not going to score points in that first game. But, these guys are near the bottom of your starters, starting to get to flex starters here, maybe a high-end bench option, depending on who they're playing, what the matchup is. You may not be starting these guys. But, they're good to have. The good news is that they all have only 1 year left on the contract. So if they don't produce this year, or they do produce and they get a huge contract and you want to get rid of them, it'll be free of charge. Even Tyler Lockett, who, as some of you may know, does have a salary for next year. He signed a $69 million extension for 4 years already. That kicks in next year. So his salary next year will be $17.25 million. And If you want to find out some of that information that maybe if you haven't been keeping up, go to the contract section on the player's profile page. There should be some little write-ups about players who sign new contracts and extensions. And so if there's any news on a contract, that should be there for you. And finally, we've got our last tier here in the starting wide receiver tiers, and that's the multi-year mid-range salary potential starters. And when I say potential starters, I don't mean for their NFL team. I mean for your Dynasty owner team. None of these guys are automatics in your starting lineup. And if they are, you probably need to upgrade your wide receiver room a little bit. They all have multi-year contracts. There's nothing wrong with any of these guys. 3 of them were some of the big signings in free agency in the NFL: Curtis Samuel, Nelson Aguilar, and Corey Davis. It's just that they're closer to 200 than most of them are closer to 200 points than they are to 250 points, which makes them, again, same thing, flex starters, maybe your top bench option. If maybe you start them if somebody's on bye or injured. It's just, they're good to have. They're a lot of money, but they're the last tier of starters. So nothing wrong with that. Your last starter, the last guy in the starting lineup is still a starter. So that is all for that. So thank you for watching the video. Please like it. Please make sure you follow me on Twitter. In the bottom corner here, it's at StevieT33. Make sure you follow Dynasty Owner on Twitter. It's Dynasty_owner. Make sure you watch my videos, read my articles, listen, and read Matt the Jerk and Jay Pounds' articles. Those come out. Matt's come out on Mondays and Jay's come out on Fridays. Follow all of us on Twitter and get excited. We're a little over a month away from NFL football starting again. So thanks a lot. Appreciate everybody who watches the video, listens to the podcast. Have a great day, and I'll talk